Robert Wilson's academic path has been remarkably straight. He earned a bachelor's degree in 1959, a master's degree in 1961, and a doctoral degree in 1963. All three degrees are from Harvard University. The last two are in business administration. The year after completing his doctoral degree, Wilson accepted a position at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business, where he has now served for 56 years. All this time, Wilson has tirelessly been making management more scientific. Economists early understood how to take optimization theory to production and logistics. Wilson's genius was to realize how a new branch of applied mathematics called game theory allowed similar methods to be used under circumstances involving real people with personal desires and private information. He became the world's leading expert on pricing in general and on auctions in particular. He showed us that it was possible to prove theorems in the morning and change business practices in the afternoon. During the half-century that has passed since Robert Wilson wrote his first academic article on auctions, the field has developed from a theoretical curiosity to one of our most practical pieces of economic knowledge.
I'm Robert Wilson. This year, with Paul Milgram, I'm sharing in the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. The citation was for advances in auction theory and invention of new auction formats. Because of that focus, I will be talking today about my work on auctions, which is a portion of my broader work in economic theory. I will be giving some examples of auctions, but also drawing broader conclusions about the implications for economic theory. I'll begin with intellectual history before I present the main motivating examples that were also the focus of the work cited in the committee's citation. So the title of my talk is Strategic Analysis of Auction Markets. I'm going to begin with a brief history of the intellectual developments within economics. So starting from the bottom and working up to the present time, I've emphasized a sequence of key events. Before I describe those, let me first emphasize that this set of developments in economic theory had a parallel in terms of the development of game theory, which later these two sources merged together in a unified framework. There was also an intermediate period in which also within economics there was the flourishing of general equilibrium theory, but I'm not going to talk much about that today. So in this representation, I emphasize as a departure point the 1945 work by Hayek on markets as information systems, in the sense that prices in effect guide private decisions. These are public prices that are signals that are seen by all the private individuals that are influenced by them. Somewhat missing in that description is how it is all of this private information that's held by individuals gets embodied in prices. At the next level, in 1970, we saw a severe critique of this point of view in economics. We had a series of articles showing that the effects of informational effects of such features as adverse selection, screening, and signaling could strongly affect market performance and affect efficiency. At the next level, in 1973, we saw a new departure in economics, led by Leo Hurwitz, which we now have come to call mechanism design theory. It treats markets as eliciting information which is then used to allocate resources. At the next level, we have some applications, very practical kinds. There was an intervening period where we sort of applied the theory, but in 1994, Paul Milgram and I participated in the design of spectrum auctions, and in almost the same time, Alvin Roth, who received the Nobel Prize 8 years ago, had done very key work on matching markets, along with using work from Lloyd Shapley of an earlier period. And that brings us to the present, where nowadays market design, sometimes called economic engineering, is seen as a major subfield of economics, in which actively seeks to improve market procedures and establish new trading platforms. So I'll be going over this brief history as in effect, the motivating source, the fountain from which my work was drawn. I had been interested in the informational content of prices. I was interested in the role of private information and how what the price formation mechanisms were. Because there's so many different kinds of markets. There are auction markets, specialist markets, double auctions, all kinds and various kinds of trading platforms, of course. So what I sought was a more detailed analysis of these features, and to approach that subject, I was motivated by this development that we see here. So we're going to study first markets as information systems. That starts with Friedrich von Hayek's work in 1945, in which he interprets the market as eliciting bids, in effect, to find out what the willingness to pay or supply is from demanders and suppliers, to find a feasible allocation and prices that will clear the market. Those prices are then seen as a guide to private consumption and production. All of this was upset in the 1970s, even though there had been this intervening period in which general equilibrium theory had advanced greatly. It was now a general way of characterizing economic equilibrium in a general system as kind of a big fixed point in prices. Prices were such that demand equals supply. But in the work of these four authors, James Mirrlees, George Akerlof, Mike Spence, and Joe Stiglitz, as well as some of their co-authors, what we've seen is a severe critique of that body of theory. Some of that was, you might think of as sort of mild amendments in the sense of Mirrlees using ideas of screening and design of optimal taxation. But we saw with Akerlof's model of a lemons market the severe effects of adverse selection, which could lead to the collapse of a market, or severe, in general, it's severe inefficiency. In the job market signaling by Spence, what we're seeing is a kind of inefficiency. All of this is associated with the general notion of rational expectations. To what extent do prices convey information? Are they a sufficient representation or aggregation or sufficient statistic for the information that's dispersed in the economy among all the agents, among the participants? So what we've seen from these developments was that the allocative efficiency of markets depends critically on informational efficiency. The prices must be representing, well, for example, in the case of the Akerlof's lemon market, they're not prices that are distinguishing the different qualities of the products that are on the market. So this is an incomplete market. The prices are not adequate to fully describe the informational content of the participants in the market, in this case, the suppliers. So from that, we see that private information strongly affects incentives. So this is something that had motivated me since even the 1960s. So I'll now be talking about how that emphasis, that focus on market microstructure that I had from even the 1960s, having, by the way, read William Vickrey's work on auctions, which is part of which is for his Nobel Prize was about. So the principal development that I'll emphasize is by Leo Hurwitz in 1973. He emphasized that markets are games, that agents are acting strategically. So this is a representation of a market not as a fixed point in prices, but as a fixed point in strategies. It's a whole different conceptualization of how we should look at markets. The key idea is that people in the market have various kinds of information. This goes, I represent it here as an arrow, that somehow agents acquire information. That information guides the bids and offers that they make. Those bids and offers arrive in the market. The market has a way of translating bids and offers into prices and an allocation that is the outcome. So this interprets the market rules as affecting ultimately what this agent's strategies are, because ultimately they see that those rules at the end are going to affect how their bids and offers are translated into an allocation and prices. So earlier on, it's going to affect their strategies. And this is what determines the allocative efficiency of the market outcome. In this representation, characterizing prices as just demand equals supply is insufficient. We already saw that in Akerlof's result, where demand equals supply, but at 0 prices and 0 transactions, which is an inefficient outcome. So the market microstructure is really crucial here. You need to understand what the prices are representing, how the prices are formed, how agents can behave strategically in influencing what the outcome will be through their actions, but I'm using in general bids and offers as a representation of their actions, which may in fact be much more complicated. So from this point of view, market design is about designing the game that's played by the agents. It's a way of translating the actions they take into outcomes. This is the beginning of the infusion of game theory into economics. I emphasized earlier on that there was a parallel development of game theory. It was treated in many ways like a subject in applied mathematics, but in fact its origins lay with von Neumann, and the von Neumann-Morgenstern book was about games and economic behavior. It had been preceding and had a substantial and persuasive literature, but this is really at the point at which the sort of merger came, because in a sense, the economic market microstructure was really being translated into the terminology of game theory, and it was the techniques of game theory that then became the tools of analysis in the later work. So from the point of view of market design, this is really a saying that game theory provides a tool for engineering the game in the sense of the active sense, and it predicts how market structure affects outcome, and it has the key, from the point of view of economics, the key focus is on agents, information, and incentives. So I'm not going to talk about this game theoretic perspective, just to sort of make clear what it is we're talking about. So in a game, the key feature is an explicit characterization of who knows what, when they take actions. So it's who knows what and when. This is what a game is supposed to specify, and it specifies it in rather fine detail. So it's not a question of just a macro representation, demand equals supply. Instead, it's at the more micro level of how bids and offers are made, how, say, a market operator translates those behaviors into outcomes. So the market is seen as eliciting agents' information via their bids and offers. The agent's strategy is to convert their private information into these actions in the market. And then the outcome, given by the market procedures, converts all the agent's actions into an allocation. From the agent's point of view, the market is itself a game because the outcome depends on not only that individual's strategy, but all strategies. We see it as a game of incomplete information because the participants have their own private information about their preferences or technology or whatever. The market design is taking account of the agent's information and incentives in putting together the rules, the procedural rules for running a market. Those rules, in effect, define agents' feasible strategies and ultimately then their incentives. So from this perspective, we can approach the most straightforward and familiar market mechanism, which is an auction. But rather than talk about a simple auction, I'm going to talk one that has a complicating feature, which is that there's a common value. And my work on this back in the 1960s was motivated by working with the Department of Interior on oil leasing, that is, leasing of rights to explore for oil over a certain tract. And in that case, there's a common value, which is namely there's some amount of oil under the ground, possibly zero, but it cannot be observed directly. There can only be indirect estimates of what that is. For all the bidders, their preferences, their willingness to pay depends upon how much oil there is, whether there is oil, how much it is, how much it would cost to extract it, what future prices of the extracted oil will be. All of these common features affect all of the participating bidders in the auctions of oil leases. So, in this case, we interpret this as saying that the bidders obtain unbiased estimates of the value of an item because they undertake surveys of various kinds to try to estimate how much oil would be under the ground. These are called gravimetric surveys, seismic surveys, and so on. As they higher estimates, generally under some circumstances, higher estimates lead to higher bids. The item is sold to the highest bidder at the price of his bid in that auction design. And the outcome is then that the bidder with the highest estimate wins the item. Well, this is sometimes called the winner's curse. It reveals ex post that that winner's estimate was actually biased, or at least biased relative to the estimates obtained by the other bidders. Now, optimal strategies, we're going to anticipate and correct for this adverse selection. The fact that all of the bidders are having imperfect estimates and the winning bidder is likely to have the highest estimate. All of this has to be corrected for. It's really more of a statistical problem, but it can be done. And then you see that the auction price will partially aggregate the bidder's information. And with many bidders, the highest bid, I say here, probably close to the actual value, but you could say that it converges in probability. Okay, now let's talk about a more complicated example, one of the ones that was cited by the Price Committee, and it's the auction of spectrum licenses. So this is the next level of complication. So in this case, the bidders have imperfect estimates of the spectrum license values because they have imperfect estimates of what the demand for, let's say, cell phone service will be. So there's a common factor, namely consumers' interest in using cell phones. So the communication firms that are going to be selling cell phone services are very interested in what that common thing is. To what extent will consumers be interested? And even since nowadays market penetration is about 100%, it's interesting that back then they thought that the market penetration maybe might reach as high as 30%. So that's the extreme case of adverse selection. So the new complication is that the bidders were seeking packages of licenses in order to get spatial coverage. The ones that say Northern and Southern California represent complements, whereas 2 licenses in Southern California would be substitutes. In this case, a ascending auction allows them to get better and better information during the process by inferring from others' bids, estimates of this common value, and that improves allocative efficiency. But when they're looking for packages of licenses, it's good to have a simultaneous ascending auctions, simultaneous for all of the licenses simultaneously, to enable the bidders to assemble the packages they want. There are complications. There are advantages. Let me mention those first, which is near the end, the bidders are in effect choosing at the prevailing prices which items, which licenses they want to have, what they would like to pick to be their package at those prices. But this is somewhat impaired by further need, which is an activity rule. This is particularly a remarkable development by Paul Milgram. It's to ensure that the bidders are actively reflecting in their bids what their true preferences are, and they're not maneuvering. So an activity rule is in effect a requirement that the bids must be consistent with revealed preference, that they have some preference over packages that is for which their bids are consistent. There is this exposure problem that's a deficiency of this auction design, because a bidder could get only part of a package, wins Southern California at a very high price, does not win Northern California, and then without Northern California thinks that it paid too much for Southern California. So, and there are other possibilities, all of which has to be addressed in the fine details of the market design. And in some ways, a market design of this kind is limited in what it can prevent. So the most complex system of markets, auction markets that I worked on, are auctions of electricity. I'm going to describe that somewhat summarily. In these cases, there's a whole system of auctions that are going on, because there are auctions for energy, for transmission, for reserves, and moreover, there are forward markets and spot markets. Prices are very diverse. At any one time, there are prices established at every node in the transmission network. So this is a very complex set of auctions that have to be integrated together. The usual way is that it is run by the system operator, who conducts a market simultaneously for energy and transmission. There are auxiliary markets that are run for reserves. And then the hedging markets that are privately run, not by the system operator, but these are private markets. They then can settle at the prices established in the system operator's spot markets. So, as I mentioned, there are all these complications. In electricity, there's typically like a day-ahead market, an hour-ahead market, the spot market, which is like every 5 minutes. In addition, you can have people who are bidding with genuine supplies that are being offered in the market, and some are just are financial traders. They are speculating. There are the auxiliary markets for reserve capacity have to be differentiated by quality. That is, how long they're available, when they're available, how fast can they ramp up. So I emphasize that this is a very complex system, and the market design is genuinely an engineering activity, because you have to take account of the system integration, making sure all of these coordinated parts, all of these parts work in a coordinated way. I emphasize at the bottom here in this slide that there's a modern dilemma, which is how to cope with the variable supplies from wind and solar sources. Well, that in fact is an example of a market design in the sense of creating new markets, forward markets for demand curtailment, or an alternative version is priority service. So let me conclude now with some summary points that for imperfectly competitive markets with private information, which are the kind that I've addressed here, game theory is this very useful tool for studying the market microstructure. It enables the analysis of information, incentives, strategies, and the effects of the market rules. You can build into it effects of intermediaries, the market operators. All of these can be included, and you can address the effects of regulatory policies. From an empirical point of view, it's important, it provides a structural model for empirical studies, econometric studies, and for public policy. I've emphasized in these remarks today that it's also a tool for improving markets and designing new markets. The engineering approach is to focus on the fine details, use game theoretic thinking, not necessarily exact representation, but a fairly close adherence to capturing the actual details of the market operation. The progress I emphasize from my own experience depends on really deep knowledge of the industry you're dealing with and how its markets function, because every one of the industries I've been involved with operates differently. They have different concerns, different technologies, and so on. So I don't think of market design as being something that one just goes willy-nilly to do. You have to really understand the industry you're dealing with. And that, of course, ultimately devolves into the incentives that must be well understood. So let me conclude now, make a sort of a few summary remarks. I've tried to emphasize that from the very earliest part of my work in the 1960s, I was interested in price formation, private information, the details of how prices get formed in these markets and who's running the markets and how they conduct their operations. This turned out to fit in very well with these developments in economic theory. There was this parallel development of game theory. It provided the tools for that kind of analysis, and it's now become an integral and an important part of economic theory. If you look at the journal articles today, about half of them use game theory in a direct and constructive way. PhD students in economics nowadays, at least if they're going to do economic theory, they need to understand that literature, they need to understand these techniques. Even for empirical work, the good structural models are ones that are based upon a game theoretic foundation so that they capture enough of the details. There's not just some linear regression, it's rather a more structural representation of what goes on. So I see my work as just fitting into the work of a whole cadre, a large group of fellow theorists and practitioners who've worked over, actually, for my work's gone on for nearly 60 years. And over that time, you've seen a steady development of this line of work. It's not only had its theoretical successes, it's had these practical accomplishments, and the citation by the committee of the work on auction improvements in auction, market design, auction design, and so on, which was also acknowledged in the Nobel Prize to Alvin Roth in 2012, 8 years ago. So that market design has become this subfield of economics, and I think for me, I see this as a good thing with a lot of promise and prospects for the future. Thank you.